All right, so I'm going to be presenting about Blazor. This is a presentation that I've done before, but it's updated slightly. So build it beautiful with Blazor. I'm Shaun Walker. So I'm the founder of DevEssence, which is one of the sponsors of the Trailblazer event, along with Syncfusion. I've been an MVP for a long time. I guess one of my claims to fame is that I was the original creator of a content management system called .NetNuke. That was way back in 2003, so many years ago, although that CMS is still being widely used, so that's pretty amazing. More recently, I've been working on another open source project called Oqtane, which is a web application framework in CMS, which we're going to talk about a bit today. I've also been a volunteer with the .NET Foundation for a long time. In fact, I worked with Beth in the .NET Foundation for a long time. And I was the chair for the last 4 years, and I've recently just taken a step back to just be a member in that committee. Mainly that committee is focused on reviewing project applications related to .NET open source projects to determine whether they're viable members. All right, so talking a little bit about .NET. Obviously, .NET's been around a long time. I've been around a long time, so I've had a lot of experience with the different types of technology that have been provided by Microsoft over time. So going way back to 2000, obviously Microsoft technology predates 2000, but the big event that happened around the 2000 timeframe was the .NET framework came into existence. And along with the .NET framework came ASP.NET Web Forms. And so if we're focusing on web UI, Web Forms was a very powerful UI technology that was provided as part of ASP.NET. It was a really great technology that provided a nice migration path for people who had traditionally been building desktop applications using Microsoft technology, often using Visual Basic or some of those very popular tools at the time. So migrating to Web Forms was a very sort of natural evolution for developers at that time, and it allowed them to build really powerful applications. And a lot of Web Forms applications are still running in production today. In 2009, Microsoft introduced another UI technology called MVC. And MVC has been around ever since. It made the transition from .NET Framework to .NET Core in 2014. And it has continued to be a very viable UI technology for building very rich enterprise applications. Over time, MVC became more and more powerful and became a little bit complicated, you could say. And so Microsoft introduced a more simplistic model in 2017, which was essentially, based on MVC, but just allowed a more simplistic development pattern for building applications. And so Razor Pages was another UI technology, server-based, which has been around since 2017, and there still are applications being developed on that technology. But in 2018, Blazor emerged. The very early stages of Blazor came about in 2017. I think that was mentioned earlier in Jimmy Engstrom's presentation. That was an experiment that Steve Sanderson did and revealed at NDC Oslo in 2017. And it was later released in 2018 as a more official sort of part of ASP.NET built on .NET Core. So I think the one thing that I'm really trying to emphasize here is as a technology, as a UI technology, the fact that Blazor's been around since 2018 does not mean that it's new anymore, right? It's been around for 7 or 8 years now. The interesting thing is that a lot of folks in the .NET ecosystem we're already quite comfortable with other technologies such as Web Forms or MVC or Razor Pages, and they've stuck with those technologies for quite a number of years and never really took a serious look at Blazor. However, Blazor has continued to have a lot of investment and a lot of innovation from Microsoft over that time, and it is a very robust, production-ready UI technology at this point in time. And as you heard Dan mention in his previous presentation, this is where sort of all the focus around UI technologies are going in the future. So I think for those developers who are still largely focused on MVC or other UI technologies, it's probably about time that you took a look at Blazor. So initially, Blazor started off focused on interactivity. And there were a number of different ways that you could achieve interactivity. So basically, interactivity meaning a single page application model. So a way that you could build web applications that had almost like a desktop feel to them, very responsive, high performance, and emulating some of the ways that you could build applications using JavaScript frameworks. So there's a number of different flavors of interactive Blazor that emerged. The first one was Blazor Server, and Blazor Server, of course, used SignalR as its communication mechanism for communicating between the browser and the server, for transmitting content, and for transmitting events back and forth as well. Then came Blazor WebAssembly. And WebAssembly itself, of course, is an international standard, not something that was introduced by Microsoft. It has a lot of adoptions across almost every technology platform at this point in time. Blazor has a really robust tool set that allows you to take advantage of WebAssembly. And in this context, of course, you actually are building applications that are running natively in the browser and then communicating with the server. And then Blazor Hybrid, which Beth Massey just covered, which was another sort of development model that came about as part of .NET MAUI. So you could, build mobile applications using either the traditional XAML sort of approach that Xamarin had used, or you can build them using a hybrid approach, and that's what Blazor Hybrid allows you to do. All of these interactive Blazor hosting models are based on a component model under the covers, which was defined very early on and has all of the standard capabilities that you would expect around a UI component framework. Things like events, render modes, things like that. Interactive Blazor also allowed the technology to be used on multiple devices. And so, of course, web was the first device sort of that was targeted with the technology. And that was, something that you could use with Blazor Server or Blazor WebAssembly to build very robust web applications. But then later with Blazor Hybrid, it allowed you to also target desktop and mobile. And so basically, this technology allows you to build applications that run on any device at this point. Interactive Blazor evolved very quickly in its early years. And as I mentioned, there was, Blazor Server and then Blazor WebAssembly. And it wasn't, each of the hosting models that were available had their own set of benefits and their own set of challenges. And I think one of the challenges early on with Blazor was that when you started building a new project, you were presented with sort of this fork in the road, like, which hosting model should I choose, and should I choose to use Blazor Server or should I choose to use Blazor WebAssembly? And the answer to that question was not always obvious. Sometimes you would, maybe perhaps make a choice and then later have to, change your decision and move in a different direction. Some of the initial sort of challenges which are talked about, and I don't like to call these challenges because these challenges only sort of present themselves when you build applications using a particular hosting model, and then you push it to the limit and you sort of encounter these limitations. And probably those limitations could have been avoided if you had chosen the other path to begin with. But like I said, when you're presented with a fork in the road, sometimes you don't always choose the right path. So with Blazor WebAssembly, because of the fact that the application is compiled into assemblies that are downloaded to the browser, means that that first request that the browser makes to the server actually has a fair bit of payload that needs to be downloaded to the browser. Like all of those assemblies that are part of your application need to be downloaded. And so that means that that first request made by the browser can sometimes take some extra time to be processed. And of course, speed is all about perception. And so if a user that's first connected to your server and is downloading your application has to wait for that application to be rendered, they might feel that your application is slow. Of course, once the assemblies are downloaded to the browser, from that point on, they're cached, and all of the interactions from that point forward would be very fast. kind of makes up for it, but that initial first request can sometimes be an issue depending on the environment you're in. For Blazor Server, you're actually running your components on the server, and you're communicating with the browser through SignalR. And of course, SignalR has a circuit that it needs to create, and there's state that's maintained for every circuit. And so in some environments, like for example, if you had a public-facing website, and you had tens of thousands of users that were trying to access this website simultaneously, each of those SignalR services would consume resources on the server. And that means that there were sometimes scalability limitations that you would run into as the load would increase. And so those were predominantly, I guess, the two different sort of challenges based on the hosting models and their architecture. And like I said earlier, though, a lot of those challenges could be overcome by just matching the requirements of what your application is trying to do, the audience, with the right choice of Blazor hosting model and technology. And one of the other early challenges, I guess, around interactive Blazor was that it was based on HTML, JavaScript, and CSS, but it didn't allow you to use JavaScript in the most natural type of way, the way that you would have normally been using JavaScript within a server-based application like MVC or Razor Pages, or even web forms. There was a JavaScript interop capability that you could utilize to call from your C# code into JavaScript to invoke JavaScript methods, but it didn't feel natural. It felt a little bit like a bolt-on, and it was a little bit challenging at first for developers to understand how to modify JavaScript and abstract it in such a way that it could be utilized within your applications. And so Microsoft in .NET 8 decided that they were going to address some of these challenges. In particular, like this challenge around the fork in the road. Why does a developer need to choose a particular path? And in fact, there were other use cases that needed to be supported as well as part of the Blazor ecosystem. And so .NET 8 and Blazor was a very huge release. There was a lot of things that were modified in Blazor in .NET 8, a lot of new capabilities that became available to developers. And so it was, there was a number of different names for it, but I think most commonly it's referred to as full stack web UI now. There was a new Blazor web application template, which was provided. And that template utilized something called static server-side rendering, sometimes abbreviated as SSR, where the main content of your application or the components are initially rendered on the server. And they're rendered in a static format, so a non-interactive format. And this was a very huge new innovation that was included as part of Blazor, is to allow components to be rendered in a static format. Enhanced navigation is basically sort of an abstraction layer that was introduced along with static server-side rendering, so that you could, again, even if you were using static server-side rendering, you could get some of the sort of feeling of interactivity that a single page application is able to achieve. So your application can be rendered more quickly and provides a better user experience for the end user. Enhanced form handling was included as well, stream rendering, which we're going to talk about in a minute, and component level interactivity. Jimmy Engstrom mentioned this in his presentation earlier today, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about that. .NET 8 was released in November 2023, so like probably 18 months ago. So this is not new, but there was so much that was packed into that .NET 8 release that I think it took some time for developers to sort of, come up to speed on all the new capabilities and start to embrace them and start to integrate them into their applications. And it was, along with .NET 8, it was kind of proclaimed that Blazor was going to be the future of web UI on .NET. I know that I've seen recently some people saying that, Microsoft is only recently kind of come out with this messaging that Blazor is the future. In fact, I mean, this was like 18 months ago that I think it became pretty clear that Blazor was the future. And so it's, like I mentioned, it's great to get on board with it. So static server-side rendering. And the main thought process around this new capability was that web applications are primarily, or at least a large portion of them, are made up of static content. So content that doesn't change on, repeatedly based on interactivity. So the static content is basically content that does not need to be interactive. And so if you look at a standard web page, like maybe we have demonstrated here, you have like the header of your application, which might have a logo or something in it, but it's not really interactive. You might have some text or images that are also displayed on the page. Again, these are static, they're not interactive. And maybe a footer as well. So all of these things do not need to be rendered as interactive components. And it's important to note that because interactive components maintain state. They have overhead that's associated to them. And so if you render every single component in your application in an interactive manner, you're basically taking on a fair amount of overhead and burden that you don't need to. Of course, you're also going to have some components that are part of your application that are interactive in nature. These are things that a user of your web application is going to interact with. And in those cases, you want to use interactivity. And for interactivity, you might want to use Blazor Server, or you might want to use Blazor WebAssembly. Those are both viable options for interactive components, but those interactive components should live naturally and cohesively side by side with statically rendered components. And so the application template that was provided as part of .NET 8 and of course as part of .NET 9 as well, rendered the components by default in a static manner. It also used enhanced navigation by default. And so it's important to kind of understand that this enhanced navigation is part of your static Blazor application. And that means that it actually has some very unique behaviors that you need to be aware of. Like a lot of people who approach static Blazor for the first time believe, oh, it's just like MVC, or, it's just like Razor Pages where, it's a standard sort of request response model. That is not the case. Enhanced navigation behaves a little bit differently. So enhanced navigation basically it utilizes the Blazor web.js JavaScript library, and it intercepts the navigation from the browser, which then performs a fetch request to the server to receive, a response, which usually includes HTML content. And then it uses a DOM differencing algorithm to determine, if any of the content has changed in comparison to what is already in the browser. And it does, it updates the DOM with the differences. Very similar to what interactive Blazor does. But in fact, it is using a slightly different DOM differencing algorithm with enhanced navigation to perform this. But the end result is that you don't get that full page refresh, which is typical for server-based applications. Your application using enhanced navigation and static Blazor feels more like a single page application where only the specific areas of the UI that have been changed are going to be updated based on the interactivity that's happening. So that is something to pay attention to, because enhanced navigation also has some other things to be aware of, as you're navigating page to page and things like that. JavaScript as well. So JavaScript support basically, I guess, became a first-class citizen again in .NET 8 for Blazor, because when you're using static Blazor, you don't necessarily have to use you can't use JavaScript interop. JavaScript interop required the on-after render async event that was part of the interactive Blazor component model. And that event is actually not even fired as part of static Blazor. So you don't use JavaScript interop when you're using static Blazor. And you can do, things like I've mentioned here, where you can wire up on-click events to buttons to fire JavaScript functions, just like you could do in MVC or Razor Pages. This is completely possible when you're using static Blazor. And this was something that, of course, was not really possible when you were using interactive Blazor. The only caveat I think I'll mention here is that a lot of JavaScript libraries utilize the onload event to, basically fire specific or raise certain events on page transitions. And enhanced navigation actually prevents that type of behavior from occurring. So if you were relying on odd load events as you transition from page to page, because in enhanced navigation there actually is no full page refresh that's happening, that means that the onload events are not firing. And so that's just something to be aware of with static Blazor and enhanced navigation. But many of the other types of JavaScript that you typically have used in your applications, even inline JavaScript, where you're including inline JavaScript methods within your content of your site, work just fine in static Blazor. Blazor Script Reload is a small utility that I developed, which makes the execution of JavaScript a little bit simpler in static Blazor applications. You can check it out. It's an open source project on GitHub, and it's quite useful for certain scenarios. I guess, and maybe I can also mention, so for a first request scenario, so when a user first makes a request for a web page that's using static Blazor, that on that first request, any of the JavaScript logic that's part of that page will be executed. But then as you navigate to another page that's part of your site, using a standard sort of hyperlink, because it's not doing a full page refresh, it means that the JavaScript on that page that you're navigating to is not going to be executed. And so that's why I created this Blazor Script Reload to kind of work around some of those behaviors that are part of static Blazor. And it's quite a handy little utility that you can check out. How it essentially works, Script Reload, is I basically created it as a very standard Razor component. You can consume it as a NuGet package. You would include a reference to the script reload within your main page. And then as a user navigates from page to page, if there are scripts on the page which use this data reload attribute, it will automatically execute them. And so that's how it's able to achieve the sort of a standard JavaScript behavior as you navigate around your static Blazor application. Stream rendering, Jimmy Enstring copied this or covered this earlier. Basically, stream rendering was originally described as usually being used for longer running processes, things that are happening on the server that may take a little bit longer. So you're wanting to provide sort of an interim rendering of the page to the end user. And then as the data perhaps that you're loading becomes available, the page can be uploaded to include that final page content. And so the idea here is the browser sends the request to the server responds with some initial HTML so that the component can be rendered in the browser, but it also includes placeholders while the server is still processing the request, and then the remaining content is sent to the browser and patched in. And so in this way, it still feels like a single page application model. And like I said, it's quite handy for longer running processes, or maybe perhaps for applications that are microservice based and are calling a variety of different services that might exist on a variety of different servers. This is quite helpful for that scenario as well. If we look at the Blazor roadmap for a moment, like I mentioned earlier, Blazor kind of emerged as part of the ASP.NET sort of technology stack in 2018. It was still classified as experimental until 2019 when it was merged with ASP.NET Core 3.1. The initial version of Blazor that was released was Blazor Server, which was then followed by Blazor WebAssembly. And then Blazor Hybrid came a bit later. And most recently, static Blazor essentially arrived in .NET 8. And so as you can see, there has been a lot of investment and rapid innovation that has occurred over the last 7 or 8 years by the Microsoft team. And just the versatility and the flexibility of the technology has kind of increased exponentially over time. And there are, like, I can't even think of any scenario or use case that Blazor couldn't be applied to solve at this point in time. We talked a little bit about the guidance and the fact that it was around .NET 8 that that Microsoft made it clear that the future of web UI in .NET was Blazor, and Dan Roth, who was previously presenting, made that pretty clear quite a while ago. And so we're going to talk a little bit now about Blazor, and we're going to talk a little bit about Oqtane. First of all, if we're talking about build it beautiful with Blazor, I'm purposely kind of showing the default template that's included as part of Blazor. It's the template that's been included right from the very beginning. I wouldn't exactly say that the template is very beautiful. There's an awful lot of applications that have been built on Blazor that have used this template. And that's not because it is difficult to change the look and feel of a Blazor application. And that's really, I think, what I want to demonstrate today is that, as a as a technology that's based on web standards like HTML, CSS, JavaScript, there's no limit to what you can do in terms of making a Blazor application look beautiful. Unfortunately, I think a lot of the early developers that jumped on Blazor were not really strong in front-end design skills, and so that's why they probably ended up using the default template to build applications. But again, I want to emphasize that there aren't any limitations. So if you were wanting to build a website or a web application that represented sort of what a modern web application or template looks like, you can do that very simply with Blazor. We're going to show that, and I'm going to demonstrate that using Oqtane. Oqtane is an open source project. It's a content management system and application framework for Blazor and .NET MAUI that I originally started creating in 2018. So right at the very beginning, I think right when Blazor was still experimental, in fact. And I've been building it ever since with the help of a sort of core team of developers that have been assisting. I think we have almost 50 different contributors that have contributed to the Oqtane open source project at this point. The tagline is build applications and not infrastructure. And what I mean by that is essentially we kind of went through a phase with building applications where all the developers sort of believed that all applications need to be built using microservices. And there are, that is a valid use case. There are certainly applications out there that need to scale very broadly and where microservices are a good architectural choice. However, there's an awful lot of applications out there where using microservices is complete overkill and completely not necessary, and just adds a huge amount of complexity and overhead to developing and maintaining an application. And so I was trying to sort of get back to a more simplistic application model, one that was easier to develop, much quicker to develop in, much easier to maintain, doesn't use so much infrastructure, is actually cheaper to run. And so that's really what Oqtane is kind of built around. Some people call these modular monoliths, or there's a variety of different names for applications like this. But at the end of the day, it's all about trying to keep things as simple as possible and don't introduce complexity if it is not needed. As an application framework, Oqtane has a lot of capabilities that are included that are not part of the standard Blazor or ASP.NET offering. One of the main ones is it is built from the ground up to be multi-tenant. So if you have an installation of Oqtane, there's a way that like a virtualization capability so that you can actually host multiple websites or web applications from the same installation, and it can keep the various users and content and everything separated from one another. You can choose to store the content in a shared database, or you can actually physically separate the data into separate databases. It also uses the localization capabilities that are part of ASP.NET so that it can support multiple languages in the user interface. And so there's translation packages that have been created so that the UI can be translated into any number of different languages other than English. It supports multiple devices because it supports multiple render modes. And I think that this is something that not a lot of people understand, is that a lot of people believe that when you build a Blazor application, you have to make specific choices, right? You have to choose a specific, render mode and hosting model. That is actually not true. And a great example of this is the Oqtane application. It supports all Blazor render modes and all hosting models, meaning like you can spin up a site that's part of your installation that is a static site using static Blazor. You can have another site that's part of your same exact installation that is interactive using Blazor Server. You could have another site that's using Blazor WebAssembly. You could have yet another site which supports Blazor Hybrid. So all of these different capabilities can be used within the same application. It supports multiple authentication models because it supports OIDC and OAuth 2. So you can integrate it using the standards that are available around security. It uses a backend for front-end security model. It's cross-platform, so it can run on Windows, it can run on Linux, it can run on Mac because it's using .NET Core. It supports VS Code, it supports Visual Studio, and it as a framework, the whole idea behind a framework, which is different than a template, is that the framework itself can be enhanced and can be updated independently from the applications that you build, much in the same way that Blazor can be upgraded independently from your application. And so in order to do that, it has to have an extensibility model, right, where you build your applications independently from the framework. And then, of course, both of those different concerns can be upgraded and maintained independently from one another. But at runtime, they all seamlessly integrate. Oqtane also supports multiple databases, meaning it can run on, it can use SQL Server as a backend, it can use MySQL, it can use PostgreSQL, or it can use SQLite. So it has a lot of capabilities that are all included as part of this framework that are just available to you as a developer so that you don't have to build them yourself. All right, so we're going to switch over now and do a demonstration. I have Oqtane open in Visual Studio. This is the latest version of Oqtane, which is available in the GitHub. I can actually switch over here. So this is the Oqtane site at octane.org. This contains some very basic information about Oqtane. The Oqtane framework open source repository is located on GitHub, of course, and this is where you can find all of the issues and discussions and pull requests that are being submitted around it. So we'll go back to Visual Studio now. And so the code is organized into a number of different projects. And in fact, kind of resembles what the original Blazor template looked like way back in 2018. And there's a specific reason why it's organized in this way. If you're going to build a Blazor application that supports all of these different render modes, including Blazor Hybrid, you have to build the application in a client-server manner, right? So you have to have a very distinct client portion of the application, which could run in the browser or could run on the desktop or could run on a mobile device. And then you have to have a distinct server, which can be deployed to a server. The template that existed for Blazor back in 2018 also had a shared project where you could include the models, which could be shared between the client and the server. Oqtane also supports multiple databases, so there's specific database projects as well, which you can kind of ignore because it's not very often that you need to dig into those. I think some developers wonder why there is distinct database projects because they just assume that EF Core automatically handles multiple databases. That's actually not really true. For some things, EF Core can handle multiple databases, but if you're, for things like migrations where you need to introduce new tables or new columns to tables, often the migration logic is different between these different database platforms because they have different capabilities. And so because of that, we had to build different providers essentially for the different database platforms. So right now I have the app settings.json file open. I do not have a connection string specified, which means I'm going to be doing a new installation for you. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to run this. So this is obviously running on Kestrel. Initially, what's going to come up, because I don't have a database that's been provisioned yet, it's going to ask me to create one. And you'll see here that you can create, local DB would be a local SQL Server instance. You could use SQL Server, MySQL, Postgres, SQLite. I'm just going to use local DB, and I'm going to accept the defaults, which means it's going to install it on my local laptop, and it's going to create a database with this specific name. I'm going to create an account, which I'll be able to log in with when I, first fire up the application. Ask for a bit of information here. All right, and we have this notion of templates. So site templates are basically the set of content that'll be used to create the initial site that's created. I'll just use the default, and I'll say install now. And so what it's going to do when I say install now is it's going to execute all of the migrations that are necessary to provision this SQL Server database that's going to be created as part of this installation. And so it created the initial site for me. And this initial site has some content that's part of it. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to log in now using the account that I had specified when I first created it. All right, and once I log in, I can see that there's another page that appears here. I can see my username. I see a few different options here that didn't exist previously. This pencil icon allows me to do some basically administration of the application of the current page. If I click that, I can see that there's a number of different regions called panes that are part of this page. There's a default pane, and this default pane has a number of different content instances that are part of it. This is an instances, this is another instance, and this is another instance here. And these different content instances can be moved around. There's a whole bunch of other panes that exist here if I want to. Each of these instances are, in fact, what we call modules in Oqtane. And so they're essentially Razor class libraries which represent certain kinds of functionality. In this case, these are all just basically HTML text modules, which allow you to edit content. So I can go into the content editor. This is using the Quill.js editor, or I can look at the raw HTML if I want to. It maintains version history of all of the different versions of the content that's in this particular instance. And so also, if I hover over the little caret that's next to the title, each module instance has settings. So I can go into the settings where I can define different types of metadata for this particular instance. I could also control the permissions of who's allowed to view this module, who's allowed to edit this module. We've got settings which are specific to this type of module. So this module supports dynamic tokens, which would be like replacing tokens with dynamic text that's part of the environment, and then containers settings as well. And that was the module settings. I can publish or unpublish. I can delete this module from the page, which I'm going to go ahead and do. So I'm going to delete these. When I delete a module from the page, it actually goes to a recycle bin, so it can be undeleted. We also have the ability to import and export content as well. Okay, so this page has nothing on it now. I'm going to go out of edit mode, and I'm going to go into the control panel. The control panel, again, has a bunch of functionality. It has a list of modules that I can choose from to add content to the page. And I can specify, titles or which pane I want it to be added to. I can also edit metadata related to this page, like the page title, various aspects of the page. The admin dashboard provides access to a lot of the functionality. And so, I mean, when we saw .NET Aspire demonstrated earlier, Oqtane has, I think a lot of applications can really benefit by having a dashboard where you can access, advanced sort of functionality that's part of your application. And Oqtane is no different. So it has an admin dashboard where you can get access to various types of features that are part of this particular application. If I go into site settings, there's a whole lot of different settings that can be specified for this particular site that is part of my installation. So metadata related to sort of global settings. The theme would be the look and feel of the site. SMTP, so I can set up SMTP configuration so that I can send email. This site can be transformed into a progressive web application if I want it to. Site URLs are where you'd specify which URL gets mapped to this particular site so that requests that come into this installation of Oqtane get routed to the appropriate location. UI component settings is an important area. So by default, this site is using the static render mode, which means that all of the content, like this header component and various, by default, most of the components that are part of this site are going to be static in nature. We also have some interactive components that are part of this site. And in those cases, those components are going to be using SignalR, so the Blazor server model for interactivity. We can also specify whether or not we want to use pre-rendering. By default, that's turned off because if you're mostly using static content, then there's really no need for pre-rendering. And hybrid means, do I want to basically expose this particular site so that it can be rendered in a .NET MAUI hybrid sort of container? I'm going to say yes to that because I'm going to demonstrate that later. And I'm going to save that. So I'm going to go back to my admin dashboard for a moment because I want to demonstrate the multi-tenant capabilities that are part of Oqtane. So if I go into site management for a moment, I'm going to add another site to this installation. The site's just going to be called test. We're going to use a unique URL called, just using localhost and the port number /test. This is going to be the unique URL that's utilized to access this site that I'm creating. Sometimes we call these child sites or microsites, but it allows me to have a distinctly separate site that's part of the same installation. I'm not going to use the same theme. I'm going to use the Blazor theme for this one. And I'll use the standard content. And for the render mode, I think I'm going to use interactive for this particular site that I'm creating. And I'll just use Blazor server for it. And then I can specify where I want that content to be displayed. I can create a new database if I want to. But in this case, I'm just going to use the same shared database to store the information in. And by clicking save, it's going to go ahead and it's going to create this site and navigate me there. And you can see that, okay, now I have another site that is part of my installation at this unique address, which is, the localhost 44357/test. It rendered the default content. By default, the host user, which is what I'm logged in with, has access to this site by default because it's sort of a global user. And it looks completely different than the other site because I chose a different template, right? Or a different theme, sorry. So I chose the Blazor theme so that it looks much like the standard Blazor theme. If I go back to the admin dashboard and I go to site management, I can browse back to the original site. And that takes me back to the root site, essentially. And you can have, as many different sites as you want that are part of your installation within reason, of course, because each site is going to consume resources. And depending on the traffic that you have that's going to the various sites, you're going to have to manage that accordingly. If I go back into the admin dashboard, each site that's part of an installation can have many, many pages that are part of it. So you can dynamically create as many pages as you want. And this is important to recognize that this is a dynamic application, right? If you want to add a new page to your application, it's not a matter of adding, a page component to your project, compiling it, deploying it. You just do it dynamically. You say, you go into page and you say, I want to add a page, right? And you specify where in the navigation structure this page should exist, who's allowed to view it, who's allowed to edit it, and immediately it's part of your installation. So this is, some people consider this dynamic functionality to be content management. I don't really see it that way, but it is certainly a way that it allows you to manage your application capabilities dynamically. You have ability to specify users that are part of this particular site. Users can have profile fields that are part of their user profile that can also be defined dynamically, and you can add more profile fields. There's a default set, and you can add more if you want to. You can define role-based security for the users, and you can define as many roles as you want. There's a digital asset manager for uploading files and storing them in folders and controlling who has permissions to what folders. Recycle bin is where if you delete pages or modules from your site, they go in the recycle bin so that they can be restored or they can be permanently deleted. URL mappings allows you to set up mappings so that if you have migrated from perhaps another content management system, or you're migrating a legacy web application to a new version of the application, you might have older URLs that need to be mapped to the new site, and you can specify those in the URL mappings. You can track visitors as well just by dropping a cookie, and it'll keep track every time that visitor comes back to the site and keep tracks of some metadata about them. There's a built-in search engine which indexes all of the content that's part of your site. Event log is all about observability. So basically anything that you do in the site produces an event that can be tracked, or that is going to be tracked as part of the event log. We did site management. Module management is where you can add additional functionality through modules. Theme management is where you can manage additional themes. You can have you can have translations that are part of your site, and that would be where the languages come into play. So as I mentioned, this application can be localized. There's a built-in scheduled jobs capability where you can build your own scheduled jobs. There's a number of scheduled jobs which are included by default. These, of course, are using the iHosted service capability that's part of .NET Core. They run in the background and they can run on a schedule. And this is all set up for you automatically as well. You can execute queries directly against the database if you so desire. And of course, I'm only allowed to do that because I'm the host user. There's metadata about your installation that you can see. And there is also a system update capability. If you want to keep your Oqtane installation updated, you can use the system update capability to update the framework. And of course, like I mentioned earlier, that would be done independently from any custom extensions that you build. And custom extensions would be, you could build custom modules or you can build custom themes. And so we're going to talk a little bit about custom themes for a moment. And so, this site is using Bootswatch, the Cyborg theme, which is, it's a pretty simplistic theme that's, based on Bootstrap. What if I wanted to make something that looked a little bit more elaborate, right? So if I go over to my browser and I do a refresh here, this Arsha template is a lot more of what a modern website might look like. As we scroll down, we'll see that there's like JavaScript sort of animations that happen. There's like animate on scroll as I'm scrolling, things, fly in. There's like animations, lots of rich kind of functionality. There's even like a portfolio with cards, then I can, click on it. And this is all, of course, JavaScript based, but could I build a Blazor application that is capable of doing this and making it look like this? Absolutely. That's not a challenge at all. So if I go back to the browser that I was running in, or first of all, let's go over to Visual Studio. So a theme in Oqtane is essentially just a series of Razor components and static assets separated into a separate project. So this is the Oqtane.theme.corporate solution. I have a link to the Oqtane.server project because I'm taking advantage of some of the APIs that are part of Oqtane. I have a client project, which is part of my theme. That client project has all of the assets that were part of that Arsha template that I've included in it, meaning it has like images that were included as part of that. Basically, it's a Bootstrap made template that you could go to the Bootstrap made site and you can find that template on there. And I've just utilized the images, the CSS, included the JavaScript libraries that are part of it. And then I created my own component. So this is a standard Razor component. And I've used the exact markup that was included as part of that Bootstrap made template, including all of the different, of course, CSS class names and everything. And I've only modified it to include my own custom components where necessary. So I want to have a navigation menu, which I want it to be dynamically based on the pages that I dynamically created in my site. So I have a component for that. I have my search component. So I have a search box. I've got my user profile. I've got a login button. I've got my control panel. And then I've got my content areas. And I've got a footer section. And I've also got cookie consent that's set up in here as well. And that's basically it. So that's all the markup that was included as part of the Bootstrap made template. And then I have some limited functionality that I'm including in here as well to load some things from settings so that it's more dynamic. And then I also have a theme info where I define some metadata related to this theme. Right? I give it a name, I give it a version, I give it some type names for specific components that are part of it. And then I define my resources. And so my resources are where I need to basically express, what are the style sheets that this particular theme relies on, right? And where can it find them? So all of the style sheets and all of the script resources as well. And that's basically it. I've compiled this, this theme already, and it's deployed those assets to the location where it needs to be so that Oqtane can find them. So I'll go back to Oqtane now. And if I go into my site settings area and I go into my theme, I'm going to change the theme for this site from the Oqtane theme. So I'm going to choose corporate theme. And that's essentially all I need to do. And I hit save. And now I have a completely different look and feel. There was obviously no content on this home page. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to configure the theme settings. And so what I want to do is I want to have a hero banner displayed up at the top. And so by default, by enabling the hero banner, it brings in the markup that was included as part of that Bootstrap made template automatically for me. I also want to have a footer section as well, where it has some default content for that. Maybe I want to have a nav button that's displayed. Maybe not. I don't think I'm going to show search. Login is okay. And yeah, so once I save this, we can see, oh, okay, well, now I have the header section that looked like the original Bootstrap template displayed at the top of this home page, and I have a footer section as well that's displayed. Now I'm going to add some content to this page. This particular template has a variety of different types of content that represent, if we go back for a moment to the Bootstrap template, each section here is a specific piece of content that I might want to include on my page. So I have an about us, I have FAQ, services, etc. So if I go back to my site, I can choose a module. Let's say clients, right? I want to include that client section, and I want to include it in the default pane. So I'm going to add it, and there it is. And very nice. And it's animated as well, just like the original one. So the JavaScript that was part of the original Bootstrap made template is activated, working. Excellent. I can go back and I can add another module. So maybe about us. Add that to the page as well. And that content is there too. And it's important to note that if I go into edit mode for this page, we'll see that this is a distinct module instance. And this is a distinct module instance. And if I go into edit the content, I can see that, this is my about section, and I can go in and I can modify any of the content that's here, which typically, if you modify the content and don't touch any of the CSS classes or anything, then of course the site's going to look exactly like you expect it to look, right? So you can modify all of the individual pieces of content, and the site will maintain its sort of professional appearance. And so I can add a whole lot of content this way. The other thing I wanted to show you is if I go over to .NET MAUI for a moment. So there, Oqtane provides a .NET MAUI project as well, which is linked into the main Oqtane project. In fact, the Oqtane client project is like a shared class library which can be used in MAUI, and it can be used in Blazor WebAssembly and in a variety of different ways. And so by default, I have the Windows, of course, Windows Machine Emulator, which is the simplest one to get up and running. Of course, you have other emulators as well, like Android and other things. But I'm just going to use the Windows Machine Emulator for now. And maybe before I show you that, though, we have the MAUI, we have the main page.xaml, where we have a couple of root components that have been defined. One is called the head component, and one is called the main component. The main component is using a standard Blazor component called the dynamic component. And that dynamic component is defined here in the code. So it essentially is using reflection to do a type.getType on the Oqtane.client assembly to get a particular component from there. And then it's obtaining a variety of information based on this environment, right? Basically what platform it is, and it's passing those values as parameters to the dynamic component using the parameters collection parameter. And as a result of that, it's going to render the component. So if we go ahead and rerun this now, we're going to see the Windows emulator come up, and we see that the same exact site that I just showed you in the web browser is now running in the Windows desktop, and also has all of the same sort of visual characteristics, right, in terms of animations. So all of that JavaScript is running inside of the web view. And I can also, if I can expand this, I can log into this as well using the same capabilities that Oqtane provided in the web view. Now I'm logged in, I have access to my admin control panel, so I can actually administrate this site in the desktop just as easily as I could in a web browser. And so this is, of course, using the .NET Blazor Hybrid capability that's part of .NET MAUI. And so I think I'm at time now, but that gives you kind of an overview of how you can make Blazor look beautiful and make it look a lot better than the default template. I should also mention that I also created a showcase site for Blazor a long time ago, I think back in 2019. It's called builtonblazor.net. This is an older screenshot. I think that there's more than 200 showcase sites that are included as part of it. Basically, anybody who builds a public-facing Blazor site can just enter the URL for the site. And then once it's there, it will actually capture a screenshot of the site each week so that it's always up to date. And it'll tell you whether or not the site is running Blazor WebAssembly, Blazor Server, or a static Blazor. And so this is a great way to get a sort of inspiration for what's possible with Blazor. A lot of people think that Blazor can't be used for public-facing websites. Of course, that's not true. And this showcase site provides a lot of different examples of the things that you can do. Some really cool examples there. And that's it for my presentation. Thanks for joining.